In this lesson, we're going to be wrapping up our data-driven dynamic web application that connects to the Star Wars API, loads the categories for the endpoints onto the screen, and when those get clicked, it's going to load the details, the first 10 items from the API data, and output them to the page. So these are all clickable. And then there's also for the different pages. So in this case, for starships, it looks like we've got 6 separate pages. We can move to the next page, or we can select one of the pages and load the content from the endpoint of those pages. So we're setting all of this up, and then of course also adding some styling. Once you select any of the items here from the list, it's going to output the contents contained for that item and give you the details. And also, if it is an array, we're able to detect that, and right now what we're doing is we're just stringifying the contents of the array. So these are additional endpoints, so you could potentially load these and have these as something that can be clicked, and then those can be loaded as well. So there's quite a bit that you can do with this API, and it's got a lot of rich data as well as multiple pages, and you can create a fully interactive web application with just really minimum HTML code and all data driven and dynamically generated from the JSON data. And then apply the styling as needed, as necessary. At this point, you should have your application loading some of the data and being able to make selections and outputting it on the page. So there are some additional options that we wanted to still load in, and some of the results will return back a number of items. So in this case, we've got 39, so we're only showing the first 10. So what we want to do is add options so the user can flip through to the different pages. And there is an indication of how to move to the next page, so it does have the URL endpoint here for the next page. In addition, it tells you what the number count here is and the results, so that you can move through the pages as needed with the results. So clicking on those different endpoints to generate the data. And we are outputting the content on the page, so we do have a function that does that, where we're building the page and we're looping through the data from the page. So we've got a function that's get JSON, and then that automatically builds the page. And the get JSON builds it according to the click event. So if we're clicked on any of those, so we should be able to pass in the next results and build the next page. So let's try that, and first we're going to just add a next button. So as we're building the page, within the data we've got a next and a previous. So adding those options in, and I'll just call it pages. So creating a document, create elements, and we're going to create a main div container, and then add this div container to the output. So output append pages, and then within pages, this is where we can add in the clickable options for next. So that's going to be right at the bottom of the screen. And within pages, so first we need to check to see if the data has a value for previous and next. So let's load in and make sure that we get the property name proper. So if next exists, then we want to add in a button for next, and give this creating a button, create elements, and the element that we're creating. So this is going to be our next button. Text content is going to be next. So this will automatically load to the next page. And if it's there, then we're going to load within pages, append the button to that we just created. So let's see if that loads to the page. So it does load next, does load next. So we want, whenever this button gets clicked, that it's going to request to the get JSON URL, and so we're going to build the next page. So for button 2, add event listener, and the event listener is going to be listening for a click. And the same way that we had the click events work here, where we're doing the get data, we need to structure the button the same way. So it needs to contain a URL, and this is going to be button 2 URLs and the contents of button 2. So the URL is going to be whatever the value of data next is. And this way, we don't need to have any additional structure. It will just load the next page. And let's just see what happened here. So it looks like we threw an error. So let's do some troubleshooting, and we'll console log out the result of data next. So instead of trying to load the button, so load the values, and let's clear the console, hit next. So that is the right URL. Let's double check within the console and see what we've got for data that's being returned back. We might have to make a separate function for this. Ideally, we can reuse it if we've structured it the same way. But there are some cases where you just need to build a separate function for it. So let's try that one more time. And this time it did load the next page. So see the data that it's loading. So it's loading page 2, and there's also previous pages. So we'll leave that, and just in case we throw any other errors, and then we can update it and fix it afterwards. So let's check to see if data has a version for previous. And if it does, then the button is going to say previous. And we can still use button 2 because that's within this scope. So append it to the pages and get the contents of button previous. And we're loading over the URL that we're going to be using as the button previous value. So let's see if we can move through the pages and go to next. And now we've got a previous page. And let's check to see if we can move back to the first page. And then the previous also disappears. So it doesn't actually output what page we're currently on. So you could also update the page and let people know what page they're currently on. So we're also going to be creating a list of the possible pages using the count option. So we're going to divide it by 10. And that way we can list out a bunch of buttons there that the user can click to quickly jump to the other pages. So let's do that as well. We'll set up a variable and get the total. And this one, we're taking the data count, and then we're dividing data count by 10. And using math ceiling, we're rounding it up. So that's going to give us the total number of pages. And now we can create a for loop, and looping through while I is less than total, and then increment I plus 1. Now let's add the page buttons. So we can do it, the structure is similar to what we have here, where we're creating the buttons, and then the button value is going to be whatever I plus 1 is, and then appending it to pages. So that should create the number of buttons for each one of the pages. Let's see what we've got here at the bottom. And then next, let's make them clickable. So here we have to construct what the URL is. So let's take a look and see what we've got for next, and as well for previous. And that's just equaling page whatever the value is. So we want to ideally have it to whatever the value of I is, and that should produce whatever page value we want to go to. So we want to slice the current URL that we made the request to by the question mark, and then hard code in the page equals whatever the value of I is. Now the easiest way to track whatever the current endpoint is just going to be to create a global variable, and we'll just call it endpoint, and we'll start by setting endpoint to be just blank, and then whenever it makes a fetch request, we can update the value of the endpoint. So whenever it loads the content and updates output, we'll update the value of endpoint to be this as the endpoint. And whenever we get a URL, that's what we're going to set as the endpoint. So this way, we've got the endpoints dynamically changing, and we're just outputting it to the page. So if we go to next on it, we're updating that endpoint value. So from endpoint, we can slice according to where the question mark is, and that will provide us a clean URL that we can make the request to. So let's update the buttons with that value. So creating a variable clean URL. And that will be whatever endpoint. So using the string method split, this will split the contents of the URL into an array. And using the array value, that's where we can start and set the page value. So the clean URL will output that into the console. And then the actual endpoint is going to be the value of clean URL. And actually, let's create that temp URL. Is going to be whatever the value of clean URL is and the first item within the index. So even if it doesn't have a question mark, it'll just split and return back the first item. So there's going to be no split. So either way, we're going to get the path to the endpoint. And then what we need to do is we need to just add in the contents of page. So do page, and then whatever the value of our dynamic page is. So in this case, it's going to be I plus 1. So let's add that in. And instead of the URL, we're just going to add in the temp URL here whenever the button gets clicked. So let's see how that looks. So that's our endpoint. If we go next, that's going to be our endpoint. And so if we click one of the buttons, we get a clean URL. So I know there's quite a bit going on in the console here. So here we've got the split that we have, where we're getting the clean URL and we're splitting it by whatever, currently it's at page 1. So we're just taking out the first path to the endpoint and removing out the page 1 and then dynamically adding in the page 1 here afterwards. And this is an array, so if we get the first part of it, we're returning back just the clean URL. And let's just double check and make sure it's working. So this goes to page 3, this goes to page 4, this goes to page 1. Let's try the different options. And we've got all the way up to page 6. And notice we don't have a next here, we just have previous. So now let's add some styling to this, to the pages. So we'll center the pages, and use class list, add in a class, and I'll just give it a class of pages as well. And class of pages is going to have a width of, we'll do 80%. We'll text align and center align the text. Do a margin of auto. And then let's style the buttons within the pages. So for the button, make the font size 2 EM. See what that looks like. So there's our buttons there, nice big buttons. And maybe we also want to remove out the API part and just have whatever the path is that we can output planets here. So when we click planets, we know that the heading here should say planets. And even this one works. We don't have a previous and a next, but we do have the one. If you want to change the order of previous and next, so in some cases you see next afterwards, we can do that as well, where we can select next and then just move where we're constructing the items. So that way we have next at the end and previous in the beginning. So it's up to you however you want to do the page options. Let's do a margin for these, 5 pixels. So there's a little bit of spacing around it. Also some padding, and just slight padding for it. I'm also going to apply the box sizing. So I usually just like to add this, the border. So box sizing, set that to border box. And also want to update showing the title here. And then we've got the value for planets. So let's update that, where whenever the item gets clicked, and we're adding in the button URL property. So let's also do the button, and I'll call it my title. And you can give these object properties whatever property values you want. And I'm using dot notation, so it's the same thing. You can use the bracket notation as well. So my preference is usually the dot notation. And this is just another object that we're working with in JavaScript. So that's why we're able to dynamically add. And these are the elements of the page where we're adding these properties onto. So they're objects, and we can add properties onto objects just as we've seen with the JSON data. And the text content is going to be whatever we've got for the property. And also let's do one more where we have the, and we'll just have the title. So we can set the end title here. So we're not actually we're gonna keep it as a global value. So every time that title changes, then we can update it. So that way we can use the title, and it doesn't necessarily update whenever we're building new pages, but we have that information within the page. So let's update the HTML, and that can have the end title. So having an H1 there. And then also we'll do a small and have the endpoint within the small, because we don't really want that to show. That's really just for our development work, and you can remove these if you do launch this as a live application. So let's see how that works. So now we've got the starships, and we also want to add in a class. So for the my title, we'll do a text transform. Let's just capitalize it and do a font size, and do a massive font size, and text align. Let's center align the contents. And actually we're going to center align within the output class. So we've got everything centered there. And add a class of my title to it, to the H1. So let's see what that looks like. And so we're actually not using the option here. So there is no search within this API. So let's hide those from the page. I can do that with JavaScript, or you can just remove them from your HTML. So the input value, and set the style to display, and then just set it to display none. And also for the button 1, do the same. Just hide them off the page. And go through, test it out. So also we want to update how this content is being presented. So let's add in some styling into that as we're outputting it onto the page, so it looks more visible. And usually just make sure that it's working properly, and then apply the styling afterwards. So that's usually the best practice, to make sure that everything is working as expected, and then you can apply styling to the page content as needed. So we've got all of these, we click it, so we should output the property name in a larger format, and then the value on the right hand side, that can just stay as regular text. So let's add in, and I'll just call it big text, and I can set the font size to this, and where we're outputting that content, And also let's update the bold. So update the font weight, and we'll set it to bold. And now let's go back into the JavaScript, and where we're adding and outputting the page content. So we've got the show item. For the property itself, we can wrap it with a span, and within the span, set the class to the one that we just created. And let's close off the span. And we'll see how that looks. Stands out more. Let's also capitalize it. Text transform and capitalize it. Typically when it's coming from the JSON data, it's not going to be capitalized. So it's one of the things that is good to add in. And as well, we also have the underscores. So in order to remove out the underscores, as it was from the JSON data, you might want to update whatever the property value is and do a temporary value. So we'll do a prop temp, and this is the one that we can actually output, and that will come from the property, but we'll do a replace. So replacing out any of the underscores and just replacing it with a space. So let's see what we've got now. So now we've got this, we've got the space there. And just click through, make sure things are working as expected. Apply some styling as needed. I'm actually going to apply a little bit more styling around the buttons. So a little bit more margin around those. And also we'll do a border radius, so to round those more. See what that looks like. And this is whatever your preference is on the buttons. And I'll do a touch more padding on it. And I'm also going to decrease the font size because they're awfully large. So there we go. So we're loading and dynamically getting a bunch of content from the API and building out fully interactive and dynamic web application just from data coming from an API endpoint. And the HTML is very minimal. It's just the same HTML elements that we were working with earlier. And now the user can come in and they can get all of this information that's data-driven information that they can interact with. Task for this lesson is to continue to generate page content from the API, so dynamically generated page content, all coming from the data from the API, and make the requests as needed to create the user interactions, getting the data so that the user can navigate through your web application and pull out the data that they're looking for. So also include the pagination to move through the different pages of content, next and previous buttons so that the user can easily navigate and select the content that they want to view and see the additional content that's available, and then also apply styling as needed to make the application attractive and interactive for users.